Hi, I'm Rita McGrath, host of the Thought Sparks podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce you to my conversation with Sharmla Chetty, who is an activist, a thinker, CEO of Duke Corporate Education, one of the world's foremost leaders in the world of developing executives. And she and I sat down for a really great podcast in London when I was visiting at their offices there. We touched on things like the future of education, how we think executive education fits into the emerging corporate world, where we are in terms of the transition from mass markets to digital markets, and a lot more. So hopefully you'll have the opportunity to listen in. Thanks.
Welcome to Thought Sparks. Like, subscribe, comment, share, and enjoy.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Rita, thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to have you here. And by the way, this is my first time of meeting Rita face to face.
In person.
In person. And she's been such an amazing girl crush, for me, right? Somebody that it is not just about her knowledge, but she's warm and kind, and also a link to purpose. I think for me, just your work and also your work in Africa, has really touched me. Oh. So really excited to be part of the podcast with you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here. And, we speak about purpose, and I mean, your story is just inspiring, and maybe we start there with, how do you go from being sort of, what's the right word? Under criticism, shall we say, for believing in causes and trying to pursue equality, to where you are now, leading one of the most significant executive development programs in the whole world. I mean, how does that journey happen?
Good. Thank you so much for that. And I was sharing with a colleague of mine. I had to get up very early. It was the 27th of April, and it was Freedom Day. And one of the things I have to do is share the story about purpose. About it is possible. Why is it possible? Because for each one of us, it is a national moment, but a national moment is generally purpose, right? And it is personal. As many of you know that I grew up under apartheid, it was tough times. As a 16-year-old getting expelled from school, and that was a huge change. And at that moment in time, what does a 16-year know about fighting? What does a 16-year know about getting locked up? What does a 16-year-old know about when police arrive at your home? This is a problem in the community because you're drawing attention to everybody else. So in that moment, I learned that systems are neutral. They shape who you are and who does not. And they are built by people. And also, they can be changed by people. At that moment in time, you believe in a cause, you actually saying, this is important, but you don't really understand how important it is. Because as a kid, you're believing in something, and it grows onto you because the lived experience around you is saying to you, you can break that system and you have to be disciplined about how a system can change. So I often say to people, I did not study this. I lived it through lived experiences. And so being expelled, and many of you may know this, it was in the late 80s around South Africa was going through a lot of times of change. During that time, Nelson Mandela was locked up. There was the student uprising, and I was one of these students. It showed me at that moment in time that systems are powerful, but they're not permanent, right? And that it is built by all of us around us because it is convenient who builds it, and it is shaped mostly by people. And it's also around people saying that these are the things that fundamentally can change. And I remember Nelson, a quote by Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. It's so true, isn't it? So if I fast forward to think about where we are today, I think we are in a similar kind of movement and history. right? We're operating within a system. We are building it through global economies, through where we are, through institutions we lead, through AI. For me, the real question is, as I think about where I've come from and where we are right now, who are they built to serve? Right. And I also, and often go back to thinking of my grandmother. And I think about her reflection from a leadership perspective. And I often go back, and she, her words would be to me is that we didn't choose the system, but we have the ability to break a system. We have the ability to have courage to question the system. We have the ability of courage to actually take responsibility and ownership around how we see things around us. So I think that for me is important. So as I think about leadership and the world that I am, I often ask myself the question, did this early experiences help me to be the leader that I am today? How did it help me to be conscious of what is happening around me, particularly around societal leadership and communities? Because it's important to understand that we do not evolve as individuals or corporations. We serve communities and we serve society right now.
It's very inspiring. So after getting expelled, what did you do?
Well, so when I got expelled, it was an interesting story because, of course, getting expelled meant I had to stay away from home for a whole year. And as a 16-year-old, fight a legal system to go back to school. Chetty versus the state, that was me. A 16-year-old fighting a South African government. Can you imagine this? And so, of course, the case was won. All kids were gone back to school. And I had to repeat a year. And it was a very profound moment. Once again, going back to my grandmother, she said, if you want to be part of the change, you have to be knowledgeable, you have to be educated. So you need to have the tools before you fight a system. Because the system is not going to change, but you're going to change and evolve to be a leader that has the tools to change the system. So I went back to school. Of course, when I went to university, I got expelled too again. Right. So I was in absolute trouble. And Ben's here, for my family around this. But I think at that moment in time, it's the lived experience around me that was becoming to say there was a cause and there was a purpose, and I'm part of this. And it was important that I actually be disciplined around what I do. So I went back to university. I worked for a big bank. And a lot of my education was funded by the bank that I worked for. So I started early. When I was expelled, they said, you'd really have to go back to school. I would have been a lawyer. That didn't happen. Then I kind of ended up in HR because the degree was around humanities around that. So hence, a story from that is worked in a bank, did really well in banking, did mergers and acquisition in my early careers, then went into human capital, and then started Duke CE in South Africa. And once again, why? Because my mentor said, you've done your bit in banking. You got to build something that you don't know about. You have no skills, and you got to build this for our country. We set up the brand Duke CE South Africa. And of course, it's a big brand on the country. And this is with amazing teams that too, when we selected, believed in purpose. I think when you think about your mission and your vision, you've got to have people that actually come with you on this journey together. Because I don't think you can do it alone. It's about, the collective building, leaving good corporate jobs and starting to do that. And hence my career moved from there to Europe, and then the global job and then becoming CEO.
It's an inspiring journey. What I think is also super interesting is if you think about large-scale change, there's a concept which was developed, I think, in the U.S. by a guy who worked for a think tank, and his name was Overton, and he came up with this thing called the Overton window. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically for any point of view, there are two extremes. So if I take gun control in the United States, to take one that'll be quite controversial, on the one extreme you have, guns, yeah, absolutely, they should be in children's cereal boxes, all the way through towards, guns in any shape or form, even hair dryers are too dangerous, and so you got the two extremes. But then the window of acceptable public opinion is somewhere in the middle. Yeah. And what we've found is the Overton window can move very quickly. And I think that's what happened in South Africa with apartheid. Absolutely. That when the tipping point came, it came very, very quickly. Yes. We're seeing this today, actually, with children and cell phones. That, my friend Jonathan Haidt wrote this book a couple of years ago now. It was called The Anxious Generation. And it was about how growing up with social media has really just messed with children's brains and increases in mental health disorders and being unwell, self-harm, just a whole horrible list of things. And it started in Australia, I guess last year. And now it's just spreading like wildfire, where governments are basically saying two things. Firstly, children should not be on these things. And secondly, it's not parents' responsibility to enforce it. It's actually the big platforms. It's their job to do that. And that happened so quickly. So I think to kind of reinforce what you were saying, I think sometimes we look at a situation, we go, people will never change their minds about this. And yet it can happen very quickly.
You did, and it's a matter of time, right? So I think, because I don't think there's a lot of people around having the conversation and the dialogue. And I think it's actually taking, being conscious of what is happening around you and having that moment of saying, this is not about us, it is about future generations. I think for me it is, whatever decisions we make now, it is about future generations, right? And the impact on the bigger world, right? So I don't think for me, you can sit back and say, well, it is okay. It doesn't belong to me, it belongs to all of us.
It does.
Right.
So I think one of the things that I'd be interested in getting your perspective on is, you've had a truly global career, and we're in this moment right now where this sort of rules of engagement, as it were, that have been in place for quite a long time in the global economy are sort of up for grabs again. And I'd be interested in your reflections on, developed world, less developed world, where the opportunities are, how you see that unfolding.
I think for me, the big question is, the world is uneven right now. Are we honestly looking at this and saying the world is uneven right now? And if we look at the world right now, we can't assume the world is going to be staying the same. Right. And we just need to look at the younger generation in Africa as an example. And we got to look at economies that are going to actually take us forward too. They may not be where they are right now, right? Because the maturity, the economy is where they are. But they will not stay where they are, right? Are we thinking with a very broad and different mindset regarding this? So if we are building something, are we building it for a first world country, or are we building it for emerging economies, or are we building it for a world that's even? Right. So I think for me it is fundamentally the models that exist right now are fundamentally going to be changing. So are we prepared to say, how do we think about that differently? How are we actually curious? Are we actually taking some reflection? Even as tech companies, how are you building, for the future? And mostly, I often say this, is that, are we taking ownership of what we're doing? So I think your question is around this, is that I believe the models are fundamentally going to be changing. And if I think about first world versus, new worlds coming in play, and even in emerging markets, it's going to change. Because one emerging market in Africa, as an example, is one country is very different from another country. Cultures are fundamentally different too, right? Languages are different. So I think adapting, for me, can you have the ability to adapt quite quickly at speed? Can you actually learn at speed? Because knowledge is going to be accessible, right? But how are you learning differently? Are you being in tune with other factors regarding the interconnection as well in society?
Yeah, I would agree. Well, also, I mean, I think we forget that if you fast forward a couple of decades, Africa's going to have all the young people.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, that's where the younger generations are going to be. And so, as a lot of what we call the developed world these days gets sort of grayer and older, a lot of the dynamism is going to be there. So I think we need to take that into account.
So, Rita, I'm actually curious, right? And I heard you say this. We are, what some people are calling a once-in-a-century inflection point, right? And you talk about it. How do you frame what's shifting as we are talking about, this conversation right now? Why do you feel that this moment feels different compared to previous periods and disruption? Because, you're talking about Africa's, age, and, it's a different population group that's fundamentally going to change. But even that too, right? There's so much happening.
So we've been through these shifts in, I'll call it shifts in capitalism before. And a lot of my thinking has been very influenced by the work of Carlota Perez, who's a British Venezuelan economist. In fact, I'm going to be seeing her at the end of next month. I'm very excited about that. And what she says is there's a predictable pattern. So one technological regime, and it's a social technological regime. You said it earlier that systems don't of themselves have moral values or whatever. They get pointed to where we make the rules around them. So one regime begins to lose its ability to drive productivity. Capital goes looking for the next big thing. When it finds it, it flows into that area. So think digital in our world, creating bubbles or a series of bubbles. And then eventually you have this eruption. Then the bubble eventually comes to an end, usually catastrophically. Hopefully not this time. But what happens is capital then gets pulled out of the casino economy and it gets aligned with the production economy. And that's when you have the potential to have capital and production aligned. That's when you have the potential to have resources spread more fairly. You reduce income inequality. You have greater good. And so the billionaire's slice of the pie may be less, but it's a much bigger pie for everybody. And if we play our cards right, that's where we could be. Now, right now, where we are is right at that turning point. So we've got all the classic signals. We've got income inequality, social unrest, populism, finance is dominating everything. I mean, the American economy certainly is way too financialized. Companies that are built for extraction rather than productive,
absolutely, yes,
gain. But the good news is I think we've seen this before. And if we get an alignment between, and I think the systems really matter, I think the state really matters. And in the US, we have this kind of religion of, we should run government like a business. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Because government, if they could be run like businesses, we would do that. Government needs to do what only government can do. It's where markets fail. It's where there is no economic market. It's where providing basic necessities like food and water come in. It's directing where capital flows. What's okay and what's not. We collectively decided as a society it is not okay to pollute collective resources. Absolutely. It's not okay to destroy the environment. It's not okay to do that for private gain. Government has to do that. So some of the things government has to do is shape the direction that capital flows into. And I'll just draw an analogy. After World War II, we had that. There was a group of people called the Council on Economic Development that was led by business, supported by academics and others. And they began their work in 1942. And they looked back at the previous sort of 40 years and realized we'd really screwed up a lot of things. So after the end of World War I, the victors left the vanquished impoverished. And it didn't destroy their ability to function economically, but it did create the conditions under which vast resentment, the reparations in Germany, the punishing conditions there meant you had ripe ground for, the rise of the Nazis, basically, because they made the provision that there was so much resentment building. And in the 1930s, there was no predictable demand in the United States, so capital wasn't being invested, and. So there was this whole group, the Council of Economic Development, that made the very conscious set of decisions. And they said, we have to guarantee demand. So what does that mean? Leaders of industry, we're going to try to create a stable middle class, because that middle class will then buy houses, and they'll fill them up with appliances, and they'll buy cars. And okay, if corporate profits have to stay a little bit lower to accommodate that, so be it. And they designed that. So that's where we got Bretton Woods. That's where we got the world order as we know it. And. But my point is that was a series, as you've said already, a series of conscious choices that were made. So I think we're on the brink of having to make some of those choices now. And we're going from a world of cheap oil, cheap energy, mass production. So your ability to be successful was, could you reproduce exactly 1 minute units of a particular widget? And we're going to a world where value is increasingly intangible. So if you took a slice of top companies in 1975, something like 93% of the assets on their books would be tangible assets. So plant, property, equipment, blah, blah, blah. Today, that is completely flipped. It's IP, it's software, it's networks, it's things we don't even know how to measure some of these things. But that's what makes these companies valuable. So we're moving towards a world of services where units of one are going to be the production unit, where small teams and even individuals are going to be able to create value. There's a guy in Israel who 6 months and by himself created a piece of software that was so valuable, Wix paid him $80 million to buy it from him. And that's one guy, like in a proverbial garage. So one of the things I wonder is, are we looking at the end of, at least in digital markets, the end of the megalithic corporation? Are we looking at the radical change in those things?
Yeah. You bring in very interesting points, but before I get to that piece, you often talked about the whole rules of strategy and, Portify forces, competitive moods, right? And sustainable advantage. And breaking down, what does strategy look like for you now when information and expertise are no longer scarce?
Right.
Because your point that you're raising right now is the interconnection piece behind this. But I would love to get to this piece regarding knowledge and expertise.
Sure. Well, I think when knowledge and expertise become readily available and free, right, what's left? I would argue it's human trust, it's connection, it's the commitment to a pause. It's the ability to mobilize people in concerted action around things. And it's very hard for a computer to do that for you, right? So it's the human side. And this leads to a concept that I've been calling strategic centering, which is, if you go back to Porter's Five Forces days, you have to remember when that theory was born. It was born in the 1970s, when physical production was the thing, industries were physical. The boundaries between industries was very clear, and you were either a buyer or a supplier or a rival. You weren't all three at once. Well, those rules are no longer apply. That theory leaves completely out complements. So the fact that why is Facebook so valuable? It made it really easy to find, Joe from my 6th grade chess club, right? So the concept of strategic centering really is, how do I define sort of a central force that my company was built to create, or my organization was built to create, that provides this kind of connective glue that informs us all of what we're trying to do. And to me, there are at least 5 ways you could center a company. You could center it on a mission. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? You could center it on a particular kind of customer segment. The canonical example there would be Southwest Air, and lots and lots of textbooks have been written about Southwest Air. You've probably read them, but Southwest Air's main thing was, we're going to make flying affordable for people who would otherwise drive. So what does that mean? That means it's short flights. So that means you don't need assigned seats. You're only on the plane for half an hour. So what does that mean? You have to have turnaround time at the airport, and. Once you've selected that center, everything else, all the other choices fall into line. Third way of centering is, you could center on a technology or a capability. So Fujifilm would be the example there, or an example there. So if you look at Kodak and Fuji in 1970, they were like the same. And both companies saw that film-based revenue was going to go over a cliff. I can expound on the Kodak story later because I think we have that story wrong. But anyway, Fuji said, no, we're going to double down on our technology. And so any market where our technology has traction, we're willing to go. So they got into cosmetics, they got into medical imaging, they got it, wildly different categories. What holds it together is the technology. Fourth is, I think, particularly important for this conversation we're having about purpose and systems. You could center on an ecosystem or a government. So if I were to look at TSMC in Taiwan, Taiwan Semiconductor, if I were to look at Samsung in South Korea, these are companies who, yes, they're in business, but they'll make trade-offs to favor what's good for their ecosystem or their country, even if it means it's not super profitable for them as a firm. When the Japanese got into semiconductors, their mandate was we want employment and we want global markets. If it means giving up a little on profitability, so be it. So they make different trade-offs. And then the last is you can center on reducing some kind of friction. So Development Bank of Singapore would be an interesting one. And it's just making things that were really hard easier. So where I think strategy is coming to is, I think it's still super important, but it's got to have this unifying sort of thematic consistency. And I don't think that many firms have really thought this through.
And I like this piece around the unifying theme because, where I come from, it is, when you talk about, Japan and some of these countries, South Africa particularly has a unifying theme. And why? Because unemployment is huge. And so what they do is they have initiatives to, it is from a country purpose point of view, to improve the unemployment, to build skills and development. I wonder if I think about where the world is right now, and you open the newspapers, you see so many people losing their jobs, right? What will society look like if organizations are thinking and governments are thinking differently regarding a bigger purpose? How do you create that movement of change to say it is not just about you and profits, it's around a bigger ecosystem by saying that this is possible, right? It is better for a bigger ecosystem. I love that piece, when you talk about governments playing that role, but I think corporations too need to play a stronger role in support. I think it's the end. It's actually pulling everybody together and creating that friction, right? To actually, and making sure that there's the tense connection to say, what exactly are we trying to do here? And to actually learn in the process, right? Because I don't think that you're not going to learn from these examples to say, if we know these models have worked before, why have we not adopted it?
Right, exactly.
Right. For me, it's like, why we're not using these models, and why we're not learning from countries that have actually tried it for so many years, like you said, even Toyota as an example when they started off, right, as this. And, so I think for me, it's an important thing. And then going back to the piece, I think for me, it is the trust piece. There's so much work on trust. I wonder, and I've said this to a few people, I wonder if it is the new currency that we're trading right now regarding trust at the moment, right? But we are creating more distance by not adopting these pieces. The interconnection piece for me is fundamentally important right now where we are in society. And how do we create those trade-offs? What are we learning? And how are we creating those, are we looking at those distractions and interconnections?
I don't think enough.
Yes.
I don't think enough. So I think a couple of things have come together that are disturbing. One is this whole remote hybrid, this whole conversation. We know that there are things that you can only do when you're physically together as human beings. And I think our conversations around that have gotten very mucked up. Like, I don't think you need to be together 40 hours a week, day in, day out. But I do think you need time to build that thing. And you and I have talked about this, which is, if you think about all of human history, the way people, young things, learned how to do stuff was the tribal elders took them under their wings and taught them how to fish and taught them how to hunt and taught them, no, you don't go that way. And, that kind of thing. And I think we've lost a lot of that connectivity. The other thing is, I think we don't measure, if you think about what makes life worth living, right? You don't go home and eat a pound note. What makes life living is art and culture and the relationships that you build. There's a wonderful book by a Swedish woman. You love this. It was called Who Made Adam Smith's Dinner? And it's all about the idea that, sure, in capitalism we have this thing called productivity and its inputs to outputs, but there's so much more to life that we don't measure, and we don't measure it in that way. And I think we're going to have to get a lot smarter about how we do that, because I think right now the way that we're measuring pushes leaders in companies to make decisions that I don't think are either in their or their company's best interest. And the mass layoffs is a great example of this. Back in the 70s, if you were a CEO who laid people off, that would be seen A, as a betrayal of your people, B, as a mark of incompetence for yourself that you were a CEO, and C, nobody would talk to you at the country club. This was not considered socially acceptable. So I think that the sort of shifting of social norms around employees not being seen as valuable resources, but being seen as sort of fungible, I think that's a mistake. I think we've gone way too far in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, and you talked about the piece. I think today, as I reflect back, every decision is a trade-off as well, right? And I think efficiency or inclusion is, everybody's talking about it, but performance and well-being, are playing a very huge role in this process. And I think, as you said, people are watching closely, not for perfection, but for honesty, right? Are we actually having the right conversations, And are these trade-offs visible so that the truth speaks out, right? And I think, when I reflect back and saying, if trust in human connections are now scarce resources, then organizations, like you said, are built the wrong way right now. Right. So I think the whole notion about rigid hierarchies will not work, individual performance will not work. So it's kind of like asking the question, where are we in this time and this moment? And it's an inflection point for us as leaders, trying to actually say, is this the moment that we need to recreate? Is this the moment we have to think differently? And although the system around us is built like this, but how are we pushing to have a different dialogue regarding, trust, honesty, and the human-centeredness? And you talked about, the notion about, people need people, right? I think it's people need people, but it's also built around shared accountability by getting everybody around the table. The whole notion about remote work, and I myself felt that in lockdown, we were missing an important component. Because a good example is I was in the office in London and in South Africa, but we were not hearing people say, I'm lonely. I need people around me. We were not hearing people say that as a leader, I may have a 3-bedroom house and I have space to do my work, but there are communities that had small spaces that needed other community, team members around them at that moment, so they needed to go back to the office, right? So I think the notion around that we don't sometimes put ourselves into the experience of what it is to actually, think about others too.
Oh, totally.
in the process.
Totally.
And you talked about small teams. I think only in small teams can you learn, can you dialogue. A computer across is not going to be able to dialogue in that way.
Yeah, if you think about the life of a CEO, the office is awesome. You go in, there's somebody to bring you coffee.
Absolutely.
Your every need is met, right? Everybody laughs at your jokes. It's amazing. It's great. And as you said, for a lot of people, they come into the office, they put their headphones on so they're not interrupted, and then they get on with their work. But I think that human connection part, and this real question mark to me, so if I think about just the very assumptions on which the modern form of corporation is built, it all came out of the mass production industrial age. Our corporate laws were formed right around the zenith of the railroads, so just maybe Gilded Age, that period. Well, what does that mean when, every asset that you have is intangible? It's in people's heads. The boundaries between you and what's around you are very fluid. And, your people may have associations with 4 or 5 companies at any given time. So it may be a lot closer to gig work, or I've said for a long time that, I think what we're going to see is a lot more people doing things the way movies get made. So if you go to a big Hollywood movie, the first 10 minutes is every single company that's ever had a hand in this movie. They show their logos and their credits and stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if more and more of our economy is people coming together to do work like that rewards people in career terms, not moving up a hierarchy, but in terms of how much they bring to the party in terms of value. And this, of course, gets to like how we educate our leaders, which is sort of the world you and I are in.
So, Rita, you bring an important point. We're seeing structures that we work with our clients getting flatter and flatter.
Yes, very much so.
Right. We're seeing the whole notion about titles being taken off. We're seeing where organizations that we work with, they're having a space where leaders come in, and actually it is not, your title is not, today you come in and you take whatever work that is there. And the whole thing is becoming more and more fluid, because through AI a lot can be done, but as you're sitting in a group, working in small groups, you're learning more from each other. And learning from each other does not necessarily mean learning about the job. It's learning about human connection, learning about, being curious, learning about new things that are coming into how you're dealing with problem solving differently. You may take the task and you may learn very differently from your colleague, and actually sharing this. Now, these models are already being tested with some of the organizations we're working with. So I think you're going to see more organizations moving that way because of AI, right? But the whole notion about human connection cannot be replaced.
No.
It is absolutely sacred, scarce at this moment, and people are saying, I want to protect it, right? And protecting it means that how do we get together and create an ecosystem, a space to learn from each other? So we are seeing this as pilot projects with organizations that said, how do we create this incubator? In fact, they're creating it as calling working labs at the moment, right? So, and the whole notion you talked about education is fundamentally changing. Universities, business schools cannot think with the same mindset, because we're having corporations moving at speed. We're having individuals moving at speed. We're even having governments moving at speed. So,
in some places.
In some places. But
Estonia gets a world record for that.
I love Estonia. I think the whole notion, in fact, it's actually one of my countries that I say that they're moving at speed. They understand the ecosystem around, how to pull a country and move at speed too. Our teams do a lot of work in Estonia.
Oh, is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I love that model as well there. Good. So Rita, you talked about education, and I mean, you in this field regarding, business schools. What are you seeing? And I would share what I'm seeing in that way as well.
Sure. Well, I think we're starting to see a lot of new models. So with AI, the sort of traditional pedagogy of I speak, you take notes, you spit back what you heard, and we're testing basically for memory. I mean, that's going to degrade in value, because it's not a test of anything. So I think we're going to see more and more emphasis put on what can students actually do. And there's a couple of really interesting examples. So one at the junior level is a school called Alpha School. It started in Texas about 14 years ago. And their founder is a woman named Mackenzie Price. And she believes in what she calls 2-hour learning. So the students all come in, and this is from kindergarten on up. They come in and they spend about 2 hours working with technology. So think of like Khan Academy kind of lessons. But they have a guide. They don't call them teachers, they call them guides. And that's the human being who sort of wraps this child in sort of encouragement, and if they fall behind or they're not doing their work or whatever. So they come to a physical place. So they have that, their community together. But they spend 2 hours on their regular subjects. And then the rest of the day, they spend building what they call life schools. So that could be cooking, that could be visiting the local emergency services, that could be finding out what's happening in the old person's home, it could be designing some kind of pilot project. But they spend that time with their guides and their peers working on something that's a substantive outcome. At higher ed level, there's a school called the Minerva Institute out in California, which does something rather similar. The curriculum's pretty standard, and faculty aren't allowed to mess with it, so you don't get your version of the course. And then students, again, apply what they're learning. And Minerva's interesting in that a lot of their students move from city to city. So they might be in as many as 6 cities during the time that they're there. And they're a little newer, but their results so far are astonishing. Students are getting into Y Combinator, they're starting their own businesses, they're doing their own things because they didn't taught that capability. Now, what's cool about both of those institutions is, unlike the reward system in traditional education where, you get rewarded for getting an A, which means you got no mistakes, they're rewarded for accomplishing mastery. So they get told, oh, well, you didn't succeed this time, but, practice, right? And try it again and try it again and try it again. And then eventually you gain mastery. And what that does is it builds confidence, right? You're not afraid to make mistakes because it's just one more path on the route to mastery. And so many of our educational institutions were based on this industrial model. So, if you think about why do we have kids come into schools, they're lined up in rows, the teacher stands in the front, they have a standardized curriculum. Well, what were we trying to accomplish? I would argue what we were trying to accomplish was taking kids off of farms and sort of gearing them up to work in factories where being on time, doing exactly what you were told, being like a cog in the machine was what was rewarded, and that's what we were educating them to do.
This is quite interesting. I think what you alluding to today, the scarce is not knowledge. No. It's clarity, it's judgment, it's human connection. And it's the challenge, too, about pushing ourselves. And I think for us, as we're thinking about it, in terms of education, we're at a turning point right now, right? And it is not the models that we are building even currently. It's new models, like you alluded to, that are already out there. For us, it is, how do you shift the mindset that it means that if everything else is available for you and access, right, what else can you do? And you talked about, the degrees we talked about earlier. We're seeing more models. The big question is, do we need degrees? I ask myself the question, do we really need degrees going forward, right? Because knowledge is easy, around this. What I'm seeing is that there are going to be new platforms emerging. There's going to be collaboration. It's about what I call a collective intelligence, an ecosystem that is going to be evolving. Like you mentioned about a person, there could be individuals building platform that is going to be disrupting the education system. A good example is, it could be, if you're thinking about a traditional way of quantum, fundamentally it may change, as an example, right? By saying that you can build the skills in a different way, right? The second thing is that your passport is your digital passport, where your CV automatically gets updated, right? The third thing is that, think about this, is that if you need knowledge and you need to look for a job or you need something, it is the algorithms that are going to help you with your AI coach by saying you're missing X, Y, Z. And this is going to feed you that you're going to have a coach that is going to help you in terms of upskilling. The piece is, so what is really left? You talked about this. It's the human connection, because you can get everything regarding knowledge, and how you get it would be different. And it may not come from big institutions, how we're thinking about it, right? And the cycle of learning is going to be shorter. I think the notion about 2-year programs, 3-year degrees are going to fundamentally change. It's going to be shorter. A good example is, we're seeing clients at the moment are coming to us to say, we can get knowledge, but what we want is a 3-day program. A good example is with a big tech company. they had come to us and said, 300 leaders, we want you to take them to China. We want you to give them access to 24 companies. And what we want is, we want this to be activated, one, on-site for real-time personal growth, because it's a sense-making, it's problem-solving, it's clarity and judgment, and we want this to be commercialized to business. On-site. Now, previously, we were designing for intercessions, assignment, and that's changed. Now, this is not the only one, the one in China. There was another example where they went to Silicon Valley and they said, we want you now to buy companies as part of the learning experience. So we're seeing models currently by organizations being challenged to say that we can give our employees access and we can even give them content free. But what we want is the human experience. We want the human connection. We wanted to actually stretch them from personal growth that some of them have never worked and lived in other countries. So we want to give them that whole notion about sense making in those countries, about adapting in culture. But we want to also be fluid about how they're learning. We don't want learning to be in the same way. And so it's around really changing it in the context, not content. So I think for us, as we are seeing it from a Duke corporate education point of view, is that we had to lean in and really now, think about this as being, amazing listeners to our client, because to say if they are fundamentally changing their business model, how do we adapt to our business model in terms with real times?
Oh, yeah.
And so these are the new models we are seeing in our business perspective.
Absolutely. And so I'm with a more traditional university, with Columbia Business School. We haven't gotten there yet. Are we motivated to do that? I don't know, because the career track for a standard, bog standard academic is you get judged not on what impact you have, you get judged on how many other of your peers cite your work, which is laudable, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but what I am saying, and you and I were talking about this, one of the things I find completely frustrating is there are problems that have been solved in business academia for decades, right, that have never crossed over into actual practice. And I think it's because we're not rewarded to. Now, if you think about medicine, just as a contrast, right, I would be pretty annoyed, and this person would be legally liable if they didn't keep up to date on the latest research in their field to know how to treat you, right? And we don't have that same standard in business academia anyway, and I think that's a real gap.
And Rita, I'm curious, when we chatted, you talked about the care economy. And, the care economy is becoming bigger and bigger at the moment, for me it is, you suggested the economy may be rebalancing at the moment right now.
Well, that's what I'm hoping for.
Yes.
I mean, we've got to get finance out of the casino, because right now what happens is you can make a lot more money, jiggering derivatives of derivatives than training somebody how to do an actual job and having them do it. And that is characteristic of these bubbly casino economy times. What Carlota would argue is that we missed our chance in 2008, that instead of reining in finance and saying, come on, people, behave, we bailed out the banks. We let Main Street suffer. And so we just continued this same casino. And the next crash is not going to be pretty. But I hope we have more enlightened leaders making those decisions at that time.
And we're seeing jobs like teaching, nursing, and community support coming back, because once, when I think about these jobs, I think about these jobs as human connection. Right. I also see these jobs as kind jobs. And I see a skill like, I see kindness as a capability, right, going forward. Because, when I reflect back, I go back thinking about who believed in me first. It was my teachers that said, you have the ability, you're going to do well. And these individuals, play a huge role in terms of who we are. And I think for me is that, how are you seeing this future about care economy right now?
Well, you see it show up in a lot of different ways. One is something that I find personally kind of disturbing, which is that in the U.S., a lot of the consumption power is in the top half of the economy, so the top half of the K. And what that means in turn is it's flowing back now into a lot of design and product decisions. So there was just a piece on there's no such thing as an affordable new car for most Americans. I'll just speak about America because I know that the best. If you look at the design of just ordinary things, dishwashers or whatever, they're all being made for this top half of the economy. And what that means is that the bottom half of the economy, if they can afford it at all, are not being well served for just ordinary things. And when it comes to the price of services, it's even worse. I mean, we have a healthcare crisis that's pretty well known, where people are foregoing care. They're not following up on their medications. They're not looking after themselves, not because they're lazy or whatever, they just simply can't afford to. And this is something my colleague Zeynep Ton writes about a lot when she talks about the good jobs crisis sort of in our economy. So what could change that? Again, money comes out of the casino. We start to see, and this is going to be interesting to think about, if the premium for being an expert starts to go down, does the premium for being a caregiver or a caring professional start to go up? Because if I can do what a $1 million doctor does, and I'm a nurse practitioner, you can afford a lot more of me than if it had to be a doctor in each space. And we're starting to see some commercial models that reflect this. So there's a company in the U.S. called One Medical, and what they've worked out is that, the doctor might see you for 3 minutes, do the diagnosis, okay, eat less salt, do a better diet. It's the guide then that works for them that's going to now sit down and say, okay, tell me about the last 2 weeks. What were you eating? And who does your shopping with you? Oh, it's your niece. Why don't we get her on the phone? Let's talk about the person that puts this thing into actual practice. And they flood the system with these people. And their results have been dramatically better. By the way, this does scale. Amazon just bought them, and Amazon does not touch anything that doesn't scale. So that's a model that I think is really, really interesting, where you're using the highly trained professionals where they're needed, but then you're actually building a system which looks after the human beings in it.
I'm seeing this model reflect even in corporate. Where they have performance coaches on site.
A lot more of that.
A lot more of that. It is not a coach, but somebody there that's telling you, just helping you navigate through the system. And it's done in small teams with care and empathy, helping you to navigate. And just not navigate work as well, navigate your stuff back home, right? So there are organizations that we work with have implemented empathy coaches, performance coaches in terms of helping, teams, particularly when you're a young graduate because of COVID entering the workplace.
It's terrible.
And it's been really tough for them. And so what they have done is that they've created these, individuals that you can go to and engage with them. And we're also seeing listening coaches. Right. So this is something that's fundamentally new. And why? Because the human connectedness is becoming bigger and bigger. There's a need to say that this is a sacred, skill. We need to actually be talking to each other and engaging, because we are missing out. And, distance is a challenge. It's whether it's organizations, individual or team members, distance is becoming bigger and bigger. But how do you close those gaps? And I think what I'm seeing is that organizations are saying there is an opportunity for us to bridge that gap. There is the opportunity of actually saying we need to fix it. Because initially, everybody said, remote work. And there's been a shift by saying, why do we need everybody coming back to the office? It is not about the productivity, but there was that missing element about, teaming, working, like you said, engaging more productively with each other instead of sending an email.
Yeah. Well, I think what I think there were two things that happened when everybody went remote. So the first thing was it was a crisis. So everybody pulled together around the same topic. So that's very unifying. You know, a common enemy is a wonderful thing. But the second thing was it worked really well. And that took everybody by surprise. But I think what we didn't appreciate was part of the reason it worked so well was we had this, think of it almost like a social capital bank. And we had those connections and we had all that and we were working off that bank of stored social capital, but you know, if you withdraw from the bank all the time and you don't replenish it, eventually you run dry. And I think that's what a lot of companies are finding now. So I'll just share a personal anecdote. In New York, I was talking to a friend of mine who's in real estate, and he was saying, oh yeah, all these guys that moved out to these far-flung places are now having to come back to the office. And they thought they were being really smart, you know, and now it's 3 trains and 2 buses to get where they need to go. And it's now changing the model of the way that we work. One of the things I think that is likely to happen is we're going to start to see a refocusing on communities, that people work and live and exchange with the people that are physically near them. And we're starting to see some examples of this. So you're starting to see vertical farms, urban farms,
Yes.
where your food is grown very close to where you're actually consuming it. And we're starting to see more and more of those kinds of businesses where it's almost like hyper-local. And if you imagine that, then cities potentially become places for art and culture and education and exchange. But your core, your root is this circle of people that you live with. And we're starting to see experimentation with some of those living arrangements.
You know, I have a good friend of mine, Christo Passos, and we've seen him on many panels. He's a leading architect. And he talks about this.
Does he? Uh-huh.
And, you know, what we have seen is many cities is designing it in very much what you're articulating it. And countries are living that. I mean, a good example is Singapore, you know, when they started building the city out, you know, is an example of that. But we saw this where he was, you know, some of the designs were neon in Saudi.
Oh, yeah, in Saudi.
It was just fascinating how everything is aggregating in one area. And, you know, regarding shared community and, you know, live, work, everything is in this one place. And that brings us back into the notion around tribe leadership. Right. You know, we're seeing more and more. It's not about leadership is disappearing. It's around being shared and more widely, you know, around an ecosystem in terms of how we think about leadership. And, you know, we can't do this alone. We need communities around us. And the notion around is that we're going to be living longer too. Right. And when you talk about the care economy, who's going to be thinking about the longevity pieces around? There's some countries, you know, don't have younger people. You
Japan,
know,
it's a great
as an example.
yeah.
Italy is another one, right? So I think we're facing complexity at a scale. You know, all the things around, you talk about, you know, the technology, but there are other shifts in the world that we need to be thinking about. So I think for us, you know, as I think about this, we as individuals don't have all the answers to solve. But I think thinking about it as community, shared leadership, is the ability to go moving forward. Because the notion is that it's not easy in terms of where we are. But do we have the ability to be curious? Do we have the ability to learn? Do we have the ability to unlearn? And do we have the ability to actually say truthfully, we don't know.
Right.
Right.
And let me build on that, because I often get asked by leaders, you know, what's the one magic bullet I can use to improve things? And if I had to pick one, it would be, you know, absorb uncertainty for your people. Yeah. And what that means, what that sounds like is, you know, I don't know that we have the answers today, but here's what we're going to do to take the next step. And here's what we're going to do by the next week. And here's what we're going to do. And for today, these are the assumptions we're operating on. And it may change, you know, but what you want to do is lift that sort of paralyzing uncertainty from people's shoulders so that they can make some kind of forward progress. Because I'm seeing a lot right now. As you've said, loneliness, I'm frightened, I'm being asked to move multiple careers up, you know, that I've never had to before. I have nobody to talk to. You know, I don't trust peers in my own company, and I really need to talk to somebody who's got the same issues I do. And so I think that absorbing uncertainty is going to become a critical human skill.
You know, this is interesting as you think. I'm reflecting back and I hear this. I'm returning to something very human.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we're hearing. I'm deeply ensuring that this is human,
Mm-hmm.
and the language of being human is being more and more used, and the piece around how do I really think about this differently. And, I shared with you a bit later, it is leadership now is becoming more and more distributed as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's who is shaping the minds, who will lead the system, because who's building the system is that are we going to learn to work around the system too, right? And then this becomes a challenge by adopting the system or navigating through the system. But having that distributed leadership is learning collectively to say how I'm going to navigate through that complexity. Because this complexity for me, it's becoming like quite big. But if you work with small communities and you navigate this slowly at your own pace, you may be able to get through this with shared learning versus saying, I can do this on my own.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, we must be getting close to the end. Are there a couple of points you want to leave our audience with?
Good. I think for me, the last piece is that, I'm quite curious when you talk about the financial economy, and I think, is it really going to be a yes, the financial economy is important, right? But the reality is we need a human-centered economy.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right. In the end, that's all matters. Because if we are saying that all the things we are talking about today here, for me, the human-centered economy fundamentally is going to be an economy that is going to be taking us forward. I think it's the and. It's not just, omit this, but how do we bring the human-centered economy, as particularly you talked about, nursing, teaching are coming into play. But I think there are things around like kindness is fundamentally going to be something that, we all need to think about in terms of a glue that will pull us together.
Yeah. Well, from your mouth to the societies, I guess where I would end is that these are choices. We make choices about what work we value and pay for and don't. We make choices about who gets what access to what resources in our society. We make choices about who gets treated with kindness and who gets treated other ways. And so I think it's very important not to sort of attribute it all to some amorphous them out there, because these are very specific choices that are made over time. And, if a choice was made one way, it can be made a different way. And I think that's something to kind of go back to where we started. Just because the system is the way it is doesn't mean that's the way it needs to be going forward. So I have to thank you. This was absolutely fascinating. And such a pleasure to be here at Cisco in London. And it's a beautiful day outside, which I wasn't expecting. So that's great.
And thank you so much, Rita. I mean, always, it's so fascinating to listen to you. And, as I shared, every time I listen to you, I learn something new. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good.